Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.
Welcome to podcast 29 of Legion Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about skill acquisition. Yesterday, Todd and I had a conversation around this. I've started to recently listen to the book called Range, and in the opening chapter it talks about how the sort of skill acquisition of Tiger Woods compared to Roger Federer was quite vastly different. Roger Federer had a very wide range of sports that he played when he was younger, which allowed him to sort of become the tennis player and the best tennis player in the world. Whereas conversely to that, Tiger Woods had a very, very sort of specialized and very specific story when it came to skill acquisition as a child. And that's been very, very well documented. And I think that his father's written a book about it as well, which he was sort of going through the more of the 10,000 hour rule style of practice. And Todd and I were talking yesterday about how this relates to CrossFit, because CrossFit is very much based on variation and there's a lot of different things that you need to get good at. However, I think a lot of people in their training tend to mix up the difference between training and practicing skills specifically, but then also understanding what training needs to be done to develop more just broad skills and what skills are going to have a transferable effect over to other ones. A simpler example of this one could be people trying to learn how to do double unders, and we all know that individual who's just in the corner for 20 minutes a day just whipping the hell out of themselves, whereas they're not necessarily spending up the time going through single unders, different foot sequences through their double unders or anything like that to actually develop the prerequisite skills for them to be able to perform a double under and various other skills. So Todd, what were you saying about the sort of skill acquisition piece? I know you were mentioning it from the standpoint of like learning how to play a musical instrument, but then also sports.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the concept of skill acquisition is, a pretty broad topic, and that there's a lot of different types of skills that we can acquire, and that there's a lot of difference between different sports in terms of how those skills are expressed and how much they actually matter for someone's overall performance, right? So I know that we've kind of roasted the 10,000 hour rule on this podcast before, and Anders Ericsson has sort of come out and roasted the popular conception of the 10,000 hour rule that it actually is derived from his research, in terms of it being pretty misleading that, you put in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice and then you become a world-class expert at anything, and that's just pretty blatantly not true. And actually David Epstein, who wrote the book that Luke is talking about, has kind of roasted that conception himself in his book The Sports Gene, which is fantastic, as well as just in some of the various podcast interviews and things like that he's been on. But something I think is pretty interesting is thinking about how skill acquisition relates to sport performance and in what environment those skills are actually expressed, right? So if we think about something like, classical music performance, which is essentially how well can you repeat perfectly this very challenging thing to do, that's a totally different scenario than, say, performance in a sport like tennis or soccer or football or basketball, where you're essentially, reacting to people who are trying to stop you from your goal, and how well can you sort of read the entire field of play? How well can you read what the opposition is trying to do to potentially stop you? Can you sort of think a move or two ahead and understand where the play is likely to develop? And then in that context, can you execute the skill of potentially placing a perfectly placed pass or chip or something like that? Or do you even have the physical attributes necessary to run onto a ball or make some sort of diving catch or potentially tackle someone, right? That's a different scenario than just like, can you sit and do the same thing over and over and over again until you can execute, some difficult arpeggio in a Tchaikovsky piece with absolute perfection in terms of your fingering, as well as the tonality of your instrument and the sort of expression of your ability to kind of add some emotion to that music, right? That's just like not the same thing at all. And that sitting there and practicing this piece over and over and over again is totally different than being able to, do double unders under fatigue, or potentially, outsmart someone in terms of your play calling in football. So it's kind of messy to think about what skills actually matter in something like CrossFit, and how does the skill acquisition literature as a whole, from things like music or ball sports, actually relate to that.
I think a lot of that comes into the requirement of it as well. So even going back to, Luke, what you were saying about the Roger Federer and Tiger Woods, you look at the task in hand, and golf is inherently more skill than physical ability. Not to say that it's not important, but if you look at it on a sliding scale, whereas tennis, I would argue, is more about physical, like athleticism, than it is about skill on the scale compared to golf. And I think that the whole kind of 10,000 hour aspect is more relevant towards the higher skill and less athleticism pieces. So you look at a CrossFit type workout, if you practice doing like a thruster bar facing burpee workout and practice, you're not necessarily going to improve the technicality of it, because it's not a very technically minded workout. You look at the more gymnastic side, and it's like, okay, if you spend more time practicing the gymnastic skills, that's going to come a little easier. So I think it's a sliding scale of what is required in the task as to how the practice affects it.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point, that in CrossFit, the separating factor is not your technical virtuosity at your execution of a specific skill. It's more the physiology of, can you keep doing that when you're tired, and can you, resynthesize whatever substrates you need to do another contraction, and can you filter metabolic waste and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, in other environments like golf or music, the actual thing that does separate you is like, how good are you at executing this? I mean, we can look at, the movement efficiency and skill of a lot of very high level athletes historically in CrossFit. I mean, we see less of the, Jason Kalipas of 2010, where they just move like trash and are still really good currently. But, there's a lot of issues in terms of how high level athletes actually execute the skills that they're doing. But the reality is that they don't get tired, right? So that's the separating factor, is like, do you get tired? Yes or no? Not how perfect is your movement. And on the margin, yes, you can have someone who, executes the skill better, so they get tired less easily than someone who doesn't execute the skill as well. But the separating factor between the two is not that technicality of the movement, it's whether or not they get tired.
I think power athletes term it as open loop or closed loop, where you have, for instance, a sport where you're playing off of someone else and you're reacting to an opponent, right? So if you look at like combat sports as a typical example, whereas for instance CrossFit, you could potentially, with the sort of the open loop, closed loop concept, you're fully in control. You're not reacting to anyone. You might be racing against someone, and that might be the level of sort of reaction that you have within it. However, you are performing the skills in a controlled state. So like you're not getting punched in the face or anything like that whilst you're trying to do muscle ups. So you know what your ability is, you know what the task is in hand, and you're trying to match those as best as you can. And I think that it's an interesting one, because you can go through a CrossFit workout and you can hit it perfectly if you're not necessarily doing it for time, but that element of doing it for time causes things to get messy and causes things to get potentially a little bit, like you said, the sort of the Jason Kalipa-esque. But yeah, we're not necessarily seeing that as much now. And I think that CrossFit as a sport does, I think as you start out, you have to spend a lot of time just playing around with movements, but then obviously trying to sort of organize them into something that's going to be a little bit more structured so that you are somewhat fatigued. And I think that, you hear about elite level athletes performing some form of conditioning before they go through strength and skill pieces. And I remember, Todd, in our conversation yesterday, you were talking about how that is effectively dampening them to potentially be better performers, but then is also making their practice a lot more sport specific. So the goal is that you are skillful whilst you are still fatigued. But I think that CrossFit is very, very individual because it's not necessarily, it is a highly skilled sport. And it's something that is done under a lot of duress, whereas usually in an endurance scenario, you don't necessarily have as technical movement. And then if you look at, for instance, weightlifting on the opposite side, you have a highly technical movement, but you have 6 attempts over the course of a competition. So I think that it's important that people understand how to use skill acquisition concepts in other sports and then apply them to CrossFit, but not necessarily looking at it through this sort of like this is the only way to do it. Because I think if there's going to be a grey area in any sport, it's going to be in CrossFit. And I think that as you start out, I know for me when I was sort of getting into competing, it was very much like a brute force method. It was like, okay, I'm not going to leave the gym until I get a handstand walk for like 5 feet today. And it would just end up in me just falling over several hundred times. And then I think that obviously you have to be a lot more tactful with things as you get into them. Yeah.
Yeah. but I do think that the difference between thinking about how training for a sport where we have, reaction to others as a key component of performance versus doing something that is pretty self-contained is really important in understanding, how specific you potentially need to be for your sport or your activity in order to improve it, right? That if we think about, again, to not to get stuck on like the Tiger Woods, Roger Federer example. So, I always hesitate to really use the best in the world as some sort of like salient example for things because those people often have additional factors that make them special that, that it's not just, oh, you did this and that's why you turned out this way. It's like that person was probably just an absolute freak and, ended up in the right situation in the right sport to be able to express that. So caveat that, that's a personal pet peeve of mine. But if we think about, again, tennis being a sport that requires, I have barely ever played tennis, so forgive my potential incorrect grandstanding about how tennis works. But a lot of it is essentially, can you read what this other player is going to do? Do you have an understanding of where the ball is potentially likely to be? Can you read where the ball is going to go off of their racket more effectively than someone else? Can you sort of like think a few moves ahead to try to like put them in a bad position so that you can actually, end the point based upon a specific, hit that you can do? That these are all things that require like this ability to read and react to another player, and that seems to be something that in especially like youth sports development, that doing a lot of different stuff seems to help that a lot, right? That potentially playing tennis and soccer and volleyball enables people to develop like a robust range of like different types of movements, as well as the ability to kind of like read and react to different scenarios. And then when they do specialize, all those skills can kind of coalesce into making that person a better player. Whereas if we think about something like CrossFit, for example, it's kind of in this in-between area where you're not just executing the exact same thing every single time, right? It's not like an endurance event where it's like, well, I'm a 5K runner, so I know that every single time I run a 5K, I'm going to run a 5K. And there's variance in the other competitors and the different courses, but you have a pretty exact idea of what's going to happen. But in CrossFit, you sort of have a general idea of the types of events that are going to show up and the different skills that are potentially going to be tested in them. But it's not just that there's different types of events in terms of, oh, this is a heavy barbell workout, or this is like a short, fast conditioning piece, or this is like a long run. It's, can you do all those different things in these varied scenarios and still just not get tired while doing them? So it's in this interesting in-between spot where you're not just trying to, perfect your execution on a thing that you know exactly what it's going to be, but nor is it in this kind of more open-ended area where you need to have this highly developed reactive sense and ability to kind of adapt on the fly. Because even though you are potentially going to be like, oh, well, I've never done whatever handstand walking into heavy heavy dumbbell squat snatches before. So there is an element of having to sort of figure out what's going on. I don't think that that's as different as people may think it is to doing just a bunch of different types of CrossFit. And so people who have developed that capacity to do, okay, I did whatever, wall walks and thick rope double unders, and that's not the same thing, but you're still developing the physiology for your shoulders to stabilize in a lot of different scenarios. And that I think does actually have carryover to, handstand walking and heavy dumbbell squat snatches. So it's interesting to think about, where does CrossFit sit in terms of how specialized you actually have to be in order to succeed at it, and how much carryover there is from other types of sporting scenarios.
What I think will be really interesting in, the next 10 years or so is watching the sort of youth come through with CrossFit, because I think that we're now at a stage where people are finding the sport at a young enough age where they can start to specialize. But it's quite widely known that specializing at a young age doesn't necessarily allow you to have like a long and fruitful career. So you might find that people are, getting to the point where they have adapted well enough, and then in, say, for instance, their early 20s, they start to find their sort of peak potential, and then they might only end up competing for several years. Say, whereas if, say, that individual was to play a variety of sports, have some component of CrossFit in there, if, say, for instance, they were playing some team sports and then doing CrossFit as their more sort of strength and conditioning type stuff. They were exposed to, your 2159s and your different combinations of movements and your different skills, that they could potentially have a longer career within the sport. But I think that as the sport grows, we're going to start to sort of see these patterns emerging where, people are going to be competing for X amount of years. They can qualify for X amount of games before they just fall off the face of the earth. And, you're going to get people burning out. And there's going to be sort of a little bit more of there's going to be different metrics whereby we can assess what is probably going to be the best way to approach it. But one thing I do find quite interesting is that I didn't realize this, but at the CrossFit Games so I was having a discussion with someone, and they were saying, we were talking about how weightlifting at a youth level is judged off of movement. It's not judged off of the weight. So there's an emphasis on the technique. And at the games, in the youth events, there is a head judge, there is all of the judges, but there's also someone who is moving around the field, and they have the ability to give the athlete 2 warnings before they're basically cut from the workout. And it's based off of their movement, and it's based off of the sort of concept of virtuosity and mechanics, consistency, intensity, and all this type of thing. And I didn't realize that, but that's something that I think will be quite good, because obviously, you can get pretty messy in the heat of the moment, but there's actually someone who is there who is saying, if that happens, you will be cut from the field. And I think that's quite a good thing, because it does take into consideration the long-term development of athletes. And it's sort of applying a little bit of that way of judging people through the weightlifting competitions, where there's a technical element that has to be maintained throughout the execution of the workout.
Do you think we'll hit a point where there really isn't any kind of surprise in the games events? Because there's only so many things that can be tested. We talk about that kind of closed loop, open loop, where a lot of sports are reliant on other people, and you're competing against someone, and you kind of, what you do is determinant on what they do. And in CrossFit, being that kind of closed loop setting, there's limited opportunity for that, and having different events is potentially a way for that to be more of an I forget whether it's closed or open now, what I'm talking about. If with the events, it's more of an open loop. You're not directly affected by someone next to you, even though maybe they motivate you to go harder because they're moving past you. The not knowing that events, at least at the games, creates it more open. At what point do we say, well, they've tested pretty much every combination and every factor that they could at the games? It's now considerably more of a closed loop sport than it used to be.
I think that CrossFit in terms of like the open and what you can test inside the gym. There's obvious limitations within that, but then I do think that like every single year at the games, there is usually something that is, okay, this is a new thing. But then what usually ends up happening is that the following year at the games, that new thing then becomes, an event, or a combination of those movements become an event halfway through the games, and it becomes the status quo. And then, but I do think that there's always going to be something that they're going to be able to throw in. And I think that it just based off of my experience, the sort of like the more that you do try to predict things, and the more that you do try to sort of like game the system and look at it from the sort of very, very sort of measured approach of, okay, well, we know that these movements that come up in the open, and these are the only things that that usually that will have some like negative payoff at some stage. And I think that it's really important, obviously, to understand what you are competing in as a sport, and getting good at thrusters and double unders, and understanding that that's the type of thing that comes up, and those types of things are more of like an entry into the sport. You have to be competent at those skills to be even able to sort of show your hand and compete. Whereas I think now, we saw it a couple of years ago, for instance, with the pegboard back in 2015. And now the pegboard has come up several occasions during the games, and it's come up in several different environments. And I think that there will always be something. I think that what would be potentially needed is for it to be a little bit less of a one-man show, and for it to be a little bit more of a few people like combining their ideas with it. And I think that would be really, really good, because I do think that a certain individual's ability to just generate ideas will have some limitation. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, and I don't think we can even say that the sport is like how many years of the games we're on now. This is what, the 12th year, so it will be like, I think it will be a long time, but the sport is always going to progress, and I don't necessarily think it will just go down the route that, for instance, the IF3 has gone down, where they program certain events within certain parameters, so you understand what you need to train for, but there is an element of variability within that. So yeah, I think that it will, if you do try to predict it, it will probably bite you in the ass at some stage, I think.
Yeah, and there's an element as well of the quality of the athletes increasing year over year, and at some point we are going to hit more of a cap on the physiological potential of people, where we have a better understanding of like, okay, this is realistically what people can do, and it's not going to be this continued year over year like, oh, they can lift heavier, they can do more muscle ups in a workout, they can potentially run longer, and then based upon that, I think that the events will start to settle out at some point. But I don't think that necessarily changes the actual dynamic of the sport that much. Like, yeah, it can potentially reduce some of the excitement of like, oh, what crazy thing is Castro going to have everyone do this year? But that, there's plenty of sports where that's not really part of it, right? People aren't like, oh, what's the twist going to be for the 400 meter final at the Olympics this year? It's just like, okay, like literally who goes faster?
Bear.
And that's still
bear
like
track.
Yeah, there we go. There's a surprise. There's a bear. But yeah, I mean, like that's not necessary for people to race or for there to be like a solid sporting environment. And I think we saw that with grid, for example, where it was cool to be like, oh, guess what? You have to do all these silly ring skills in addition to just muscle ups and chest to bar pull ups. And like, yeah, it was cool to see people do that, and cool to see people lift some heavier weights. But I actually don't think that at least for me, had as much like it wasn't as interesting as the CrossFit test, because it just seemed a little flashy and a little silly. And I think that at this point, like Luke, you mentioned, there's really one person calling the shots, but it seems clear that Castro has decided that he doesn't necessarily want to just go heavier or add more like crazy stuff. That yeah, there are going to be like twists and things that he wants to throw in, but it's much more about can you handle the volume of testing? Can you handle the sort of like mental challenges of not knowing what's going on and having something thrown at you that's more than you've done in the past or whatever? And that seems to be the character of testing that the sport is currently based upon. And yeah, that may change if there's more people involved. But in terms of a skill acquisition perspective, as more and more skills do potentially get added to the theoretical testing pool, that that's just more stuff that people have to learn how to do, but that a lot of it is going to be just like we talked about with everything else. It's like, all right, establish a baseline level of ability and then learn to do it when you're really tired.
Yeah, like I think that you have sort of the breadth and depth of the testing will always expand, but then ultimately, because of the way CrossFit is and because of what it is trying to test as a sport, that it will just increase the density of it. So it will just increase the intensity of like how they are testing it through, having so many different more variables added to it, or combinations. And I think that each year there usually tends to be a couple of themes or a theme that goes on for a couple of years, and then it moves out of it. And I think that, for instance, you had like 2015 where they had several hero workouts, and it was just a complete sort of beat down to and it was a very, very hot. And I think that a lot of people you've heard in the games of recent, they've said, it's not necessarily as hard as it used to be in terms of volume. However, the tests are a lot more, there's a lot more range to them. And I think that this is something that's really important, for instance, for sort of smaller local competitions and then mid-range competitions to actually understand as well. Because you go to these events that are, just up and coming, and it just becomes almost, it seems like a pissing contest between competition organizers where they can, how can we make things the hardest that they can be? And, like for instance, I watched a competition of beginners going through, and you have in scaled division as such doing single unders, but then they're also, required to squat snatch 50 and 35 kilos. And it's like, that doesn't link up. And it's, and it's just like people, scaling is just reducing the weight, right? And it's like, no. But I think that the sport will definitely, especially with the sanctional events now, because you're going to have so much more. To my knowledge, I know that there's no input from HQ on the sanctional events, so there's going to be a lot of different directions potentially going, and I think that you'll sort of start to see that.
John, you got anything to say about that?
No.
John, do you want to do an outro?
I don't always have an opinion on stuff. Okay, so sometimes when you like throw it over to me, it's like, well, I don't really think about these things in life.
You can't do a Federer and.
Yeah.
Todd, Luke's making noises on the recording again.
Backhand.
All right, I'll do an outro.
Beep.
Yeah, so this has been our post-games podcast, breaking down all the games coverage from the last 5 days. It was great to see some of the performances out there. I think we were all surprised by Vellner, so that was good to see.
Yeah, he got sunburn apparently.
We'll see you again next year for the 2020 March games, because as we know, there's going to be 2 CrossFit games this year. That was a surprise announcement. I don't think anyone was expecting that. So we'll see you for CrossFit Games 2020 Part 1 in March 2020.
Note that this is recorded the week before the 2019 CrossFit Games. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.